Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm very thrilled to welcome Marcus Blanton-Schaedel to the podcast today to talk about The House That Dripped Blood, an anthology horror film starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, among many others, released 50 years ago in April of 1971. How are we doing, Marcus?
I'm doing very well, especially for this beautiful day. I can't complain. And also getting to talk about this very cool gem of horror cinema. So pretty excited.
So I was watching this movie yesterday, Marcus, saying, okay, this is why I'm doing this podcast, to discover movies like this. I don't think I ever would have seen this movie unless it maybe had been on like Shudder or something. And I came across it one random day. I don't think I would have ever seen this. It's kind of obscure. I'm a huge horror buff. I had never heard of this one before. And as we're going to talk about here, this was a blast. I really enjoyed this.
Yes, I had the same experience and all that too. I don't think I would have came across this unless you helped connect me to it too. So it was very, very fun ride of a roller coaster, I would say.
Yeah, I did a deep dive into what came out in 1971 in horror. And as I've talked about on the podcast before, early 70s, not a great time for horror films. In 1968, you get Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead, two classics. And then between 69 and 71, there's really nothing iconic or really famous in the horror realm. And so sometimes I have to dive in deep, okay, what horror films came out in 71 that I might want to talk about on the podcast? And thankfully, Wikipedia had a page of just horror movies released in the year of 71. And so I was researching all of them. And then I came across this and I was like, ooh, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, an anthology horror film. I love anthology horror movies. We don't get a whole lot of them these days, but occasionally we do. And I was like, ooh, an early 70s one would be a lot of fun because I had seen Tales from the Crypt, an early 70s horror film that's a lot of fun with Joan Collins and a bunch of people. And so when I came across this, oh, this will be a fun one to do a podcast about. And I was so happy watching it yesterday. Yes, it exceeded my expectations. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I honestly had a conversation with myself about that too, with the early 70s horror, because I was even thinking back, I kind of surprised myself with how much 70s horror I do like, especially in the slasher genre too. I felt like that was very open doors for the slasher filmmaking. But with this particular film, it had me really, like what you did, dig deeper into the early 70s, because most of the slashers were in the mid to late 70s. And I'm do I know any early 70s horror either? And I'm like, wow, I don't. I need to step my game up and all.
Yeah, the first big horror hit of the 70s is The Exorcist, which came out December 26, 1973.
Exactly. Yeah.
After that, we start getting some big ones like Texas Chainsaw, like Jaws, like Carrie, like Black Christmas. It's almost like it's after The Exorcist where a lot of these start coming out. I mean, there is one that I think is significant, and that's Wes Craven's debut feature film, The Last House on the Left, which came out in 1972. So that's a big film I'm excited to talk about next year on the podcast. I'm a huge Wes Craven fan. I mean, if I had to pick a favorite horror director, it might be him, because he really, did some amazing work in the genre. Always, every decade, he has a major film that's a lot different from the last kind of iconic one he made, like Hills Have Eyes, like Nightmare on Elm Street, like Scream. He kept reinventing horror every decade, which was really cool.
I think that's what makes him such a very flexible and very creative director. I would say he's definitely in my top 5 favorite directors list too. So he's a gem.
Yeah, absolutely. I miss him a lot too. Gosh, man. I mean, we lost him in 2015, I believe at the age of 76. And it was almost like, oh man. I mean, I know there's not a whole lot of directors who work after 75, 76, especially 80, unless you're Clint Eastwood and you'll work till you're 101.
Exactly.
But I felt like, oh man, I felt like we had another 3 or 4 really good films for to get from Wes Craven, and it was disappointing. But boy, the legacy he left us. I mean, he is just an icon for me. And so, before we get into the House of Drip Blood, Marcus, I just wanted to talk about what inspired your love of horror films, and if you have a few favorites you can share with us, that would be great.
Yeah. So I can just think back like when I was just a small, like little kiddo, and my family was not really into like showing horror to children or anything. They're very protective. I think really what my mom just had me show was like A Nightmare Before Christmas type of jazz. So here I was at 5 sneaking around in my bedroom with the VHS tape of Halloween 1978.
Yes, I had that
And
too.
yeah, and I'm like, I fell in love with this. I mean, it wasn't traumatizing or anything for me, but I was hooked. And then I think by the age of 13, I finally just told my mom, like, I've been watching horror films, been sneaking, and it's fine.
Yeah.
At all. So I just grew up like doing that whole thing of every time there's a new release, I would go to the movie theater, collect movie stub tickets, which I still have those. And now I'm just at a point where I feel like I just love having conversations like this about horror cinema, psychological thriller cinema, and just creating like that platform for us to just have fun and maybe like have non-horror lovers kind of like explore some opportunities of like watching a horror film too.
And
Yeah.
you would say John Carpenter's Halloween from 78, if not your favorite horror film, it's in your top 5, because that's my favorite horror film. I never get sick of that movie. I can watch that movie twice a year, never get sick of it. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that I'm the same boat. Like I can watch that at any time. It's like my good comfort horror film. It just gets me into that comfort mood of the atmosphere of that. For some reason, it's just Halloween. We like to think of the festivities of
Yeah.
Halloween. So seeing all that in that film and plus more, it just provides that comfort. But I think it really did mold me into liking some other like horror films too. Just to name a few. For example, one of the ones that I do like is The Craft, which a lot of people
Yes.
don't see that as like horror. But I mean, if you really think about it, there are those elements. But that one's another comfort type of horror film. And then here, I guess you say recently, 2017, Creep 2. That's
Okay.
another like horror comfort movie and kind of has me like play that role of like, what would I do in that moment and all. Same thing with Halloween 1978.
What I love about horror films is that every decade they're almost different in a way. There's always like every 7 to 10 years, there's like a new resurgence of horror films and different kinds of films. We did an episode last October, right for Halloween, 50 years of horror movies I recorded. And we talked about how like just the look and feel of horror films of the 70s are different from the 80s or different from the 90s, right? Like 90s was about scream and meta and like, oh, we're going to comment about horror films. And then you get into the 2000s and you're getting a lot of these kind of torture porn, a lot of remakes. And then the last 10 years have been really interesting because it's kind of gone back to that 70s mentality of kind of quieter, eerie, unusual, smaller horror films that I love. And so we've gotten a lot of good ones over the last few years too.
It's like history repeating itself in that way. Yeah, that's how I look at it. And
yeah,
it's so interesting to see the history of horror cinema, just, yeah, like what you said, evolving, but then again, kind of go into a full circle of repeating certain patterns too, like going back to the basics. So it is an exciting time because I feel like also when I'm like looking up certain years of horror, there seems like there's like an increase of horror being made as well as we are like going through each decade. So I feel like we're even seeing like an evolution of the community kind of showing more interest in being like, how can we make this even more creative or different and stand out even more? So it's very, very exciting time for horror and psychological thriller, in my opinion.
Yeah, horror has been around from the beginning of storytelling, right? In stories, in novels, in film. You go all the way back to the silent films of like, the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. There are horror films all over the place. So this is not something that started late. Like this has been around from the beginning. But I would argue that like 1970, 1971, 1972, not the greatest time for horror cinema. You really have to like go deep on Wikipedia's pages. Like what came out this year? Okay, The House That Dripped Blood. That sounds interesting.
Yes.
So let's talk about our movie we looked at for today. I have a brief
Mhm.
summary and then some trivia about the film. And there's
Okay.
also another figure I want to talk about who I haven't mentioned yet, was also a key figure in me wanting to look at this film and talk about it for the podcast. So, a Scotland Yard detective investigating the disappearance of a famous movie star ends up looking into 4 unusual cases involving the same house and different tenants. Number 1, a novelist who encounters the villain he created in his most recent horror novel. Number 2, a man who becomes obsessed with a wax figure in a horror museum that reminds him of a woman from his past. Number 3, a young girl who becomes interested in witchcraft as her overprotective and frightened father looks on. And number 4, a horror film actor who buys a black cloak from a mysterious shop and finds himself, whenever he wears the cloak, turning into a vampire himself. So after these 4 stories play out, we follow that original detective to the house where he discovers something he never could have expected. That's kind of like the main storyline of this. I mean, I don't think we have to go too deep into each of the 4, because what is each story in this movie? 20 to 25 minutes?
Yeah,
They're not
that's
super
about right.
long.
Yeah.
I think the movie overall is about an hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And I feel
It's
like a lot of movies of that length, sometimes you'll see just 3, or you'll see some that have like 5 or 6, like really shorter ones. This one, you get 4.
it didn't feel too long of a movie either, too,
Mm-hmm.
watching it. I felt like it was pretty good pacing of each story, too. I probably, my only thing about the length, maybe which story? Oh, it was. I felt like the second story was a little bit kind of draggy, in my opinion. There was just a moment in there I felt it, but really overall, yeah, I just felt like it was pretty like a quick, easy watch, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. I thought my problem with the second story is it's not really about the house. That was kind
Yes,
of
I
I
think
was
that's
like,
probably what. Yeah.
the other 3 are really like they take place a lot at the house, and the second one,
Mhm.
Peter Cushing, 80 to 85% of that is at another location. So I'm like, well, it's called The House of Dripped Blood, but okay.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be about this house. I felt the one that dragged the most was the third story with Christopher Lee, and partly because like the story with the little girl and the witchcraft, I could kind of see coming. I'm like, oh, I know where this is going. But because I've seen other films, many of which probably released later, like after this film in 71. But I still think it's a lot of fun, and we're going to talk about it. Before we talk about our more opinions about the movie, I had some trivia to share.
Yeah.
So this is the other figure affiliated with this film that made me want to watch it and talk about it for the podcast. And that's Robert Bloch, wrote the screenplay,
Yes.
who's most well known, of course, for writing the novel of Psycho, which would be adapted by Joseph Stefano and directed by Alfred Hitchcock for 1960, one of the most iconic, famous horror films of all time. So,
I
so
could
I
see that.
yeah,
I could.
sometimes I have to remember. Wait, okay, Robert Bloch. He didn't write the movie. He just wrote the book, and the book is what got Hitchcock excited, and then he hired a screenwriter to adapt it. But Robert Bloch's name is all. Whenever I see that name, it's like Psycho. Like I just go there. So to see him, this isn't based on like one of his stories. Like he wrote this screenplay for this movie, so that's kind of cool. So let's see. So he wrote lots of scripts for television and film in his long career. He wrote episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Thriller, a really cool series starring Boris Karloff. I don't know if you've heard about that. I first discovered it reading Stephen King's nonfiction book Dance Macabre, where he talks about Thriller being the best like of the horror series that he saw when he was younger. And so I found a used copy on eBay of the DVD set, like the whole thing, and
Oh,
it's
cool.
really great. Like there were
Okay.
5 to 10 episodes that like knocked me out, were fantastic. So if you haven't seen Thriller, check that out. It's always introduced by Boris Karloff, and sometimes he's in the episode. And it's one of those old series like The Twilight Zone, like Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Every episode's a new story. And the cool thing about Thriller is, as it went along, it started as just kind of like detective stories and mysteries. And then as Thriller went along, it turned into a horror series. Like the last few episodes, last dozens of episodes, whatever, like it goes into supernatural territory and ghosts and demons. And it's like for like 61, 62, it's kind of interesting. It's like an interesting era for that. He also wrote episodes of Star Trek, which I did not know that.
I did not know that either. Wow.
Robert Bloch wrote some of the original Star Trek series from the 60s. Okay.
Okay.
He also wrote the film Straight Jacket, starring Joan Crawford. That was the post Whatever Happened to Baby Jane era, right? Where she was doing like horror films and thrillers and stuff. And then he also wrote a very fun horror film I discovered on Shudder a couple years ago called The Deadly Bees.
Yes.
Have you heard of that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I may have guilty watched that.
Really kind of cheesy special effects, circa like mid 60s, but a lot of fun. The House That Dripped Blood was directed by Peter Duffel. He worked mostly in television, only directing a handful of films. I looked at his credits. None of the other films he directed I had heard of. He wanted this film to be called Death and the Maiden, but the producer of the film, Milton Subotsky, insisted it be called The House That Dripped Blood, saying, "We're in the marketplace. We have to use this title."
Okay.
There is no drop of blood in the whole movie. Did you notice that?
Exactly. I was like, so what was his thought on that? Where was he going with that?
The title of this is The House That Dripped Blood. The house does not ever drip blood, and there's no blood in the movie at all.
Not at all.
That's something that probably would change, right, Marcus, if they made this in 2021? Would there be some blood?
I think some will be an understatement. I think with today's
Buckets?
world, yeah, I feel like it'd just be buckets and all that at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I do like the title. It's kind of silly. I sometimes forget it. There's been a couple films I've talked about for the podcast where I just recorded an episode for a film. The episode will be dropping in a few more weeks on Johnny Got His Gun, the only film directed by Dalton Trumbo. And throughout the episode, I kept forgetting what the title was. I kept wanting to call it Johnny Get Your Gun, like Annie Get Your Gun.
Yeah, I was having the song playing in my head when you said that. I was like, oh man, I'd be so distracted.
The House That Dripped Blood. I love it. So let's see a few other things. Vincent Price was offered the part of Paul Henderson, the vampire guy, right? But matters including his exclusive contract with American International Pictures pertaining to his involvement in horror films proved to be an impediment. So he ended up not being in this film. I'm like, the guy was in every horror movie known to man. He couldn't be in this.
I know, that's what I was thinking. I was like, he has like his hands in a lot of projects. So that didn't make
Especially at this time. We're doing an episode, I haven't recorded it yet, airing in May on The Abominable Dr. Phibes. And we're going to talk about Vincent Price's career. That film came out in May of 71, I believe. So we're going to talk about that one soon. So yeah, he's a super important figure in horror cinema, going back to the 50s. He's in even some, I feel like some genre films of the 40s too. He's one of those actors where we think of him as an older actor, but then if you go look at some films of the 30s and 40s, he's like a young, dashing guy in those, and he pops up in some famous films. So let's see. Peter Cushing tried to get out of his contract so he would not be away from his wife, Helen, who was ill at the time of this movie's filming, but he, for some reason, had to carry on. He couldn't get out of the contract. So I don't think he's happy making this movie then.
I think we can probably see some moments in the movie where he's like really internally conflicted, I would say.
Well, what's weird is that so he wanted to get out of the contract so he could spend more time with his wife who was ill. And his whole storyline is about him looking at this wax figure that reminds him of a woman he lost who he loved. Kind of interesting, kind of weird.
It's like, talk about some trigger warning there for him.
Yeah, exactly. And then this I actually noticed without even researching. I noticed this in the movie, and I'd be curious to know if you noticed this too. So the horror movie star Paul Henderson, he says he misses the great horror movies and mentions Dracula. And then he adds, well, the one with Bela Lugosi, of course, not that new fellow. Did you notice that?
I
The new
caught on to
fellow,
that.
referring to Christopher Lee, who had
Yep.
played Dracula like 7 times, who is also in the movie.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of like, yeah, I caught that. I mean, I think that's a meantful, like one of those horror comedy moments too. That I
Yeah,
think
it
they're
got a
trying
laugh
to
out of me because I knew what he
yeah,
was
I was
referring
like, I
to.
think they definitely did a very good job with that part.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know, like, when Christopher Lee saw the film at the premiere or whatever, did he laugh too, or was he like,
Who
cut it
knows?
out, cut out that joke? So the film was a minor success in the UK, but it did well in the US, got lots of good reviews. Variety called this film one of the most entertaining of its genre to come along in several years and should prove strong opposition to the general monopoly of that market by Hammer Films. Even for filmgoers who don't usually follow the shocker market, this one is worthwhile. That was Variety in early
I was gonna say
71.
that's big time for Variety, like have Variety say that about
I would
you.
have thought this movie would have come and gone, like no critic would have said nice things about it. So I was like, wow,
Same.
I found like
Yeah.
3 others too. That was the nicest one I found, but I was like,
Yeah.
wow. So kind of interesting. So it actually, in this kind of dry period of horror cinema, early 71, like I think maybe some critics were just so hungry for something. Like, oh, this
Yeah.
one's not bad. I'll say some nice things about it. All right, so Marcus, what did we think of The House That Dripped Blood? As a big horror fan, how did this one work for you?
I feel like this is like a really good atmospheric type of horror film, in my opinion. I think it does a really good job of balancing out the horror elements and the comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't feel like the comedy is like losing its punch when they're doing the joke, or I don't feel like the horror is being washed out by the comedy either. So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it did a really good job in that sense of it. So I really, really love that. That was like a gold star for me.
That's interesting you say comedy. I didn't really think about that very much. I feel like the fourth story with the horror film star, that had
Mhm.
some comedy bits and things, but I'm trying to think, did the first 3 stories have a lot of humor? Because I didn't notice them. I didn't notice humor much in the first 3 stories.
I was so in the first one, I kind of was like having some moments of laughing with the multiple twists that was kept
Oh, the
happening.
twist at the end of story 1. Yeah.
Just like a twist and a twist and a twist. So I'm just like, I don't know. I thought maybe that was like a comedy part that they're trying to do. Just like,
Yeah,
look,
no, I got
another
that.
twist.
That's a good point. So my favorite of the 4 by far was the first story. I loved every second of the first story. I thought it was great. I loved the atmosphere. I found the quote unquote villain, the guy he keeps seeing, really genuinely creepy. Like that part where he's sitting behind the chair in the dark and you just see a little bit of his face was really, I was like, that's pretty creepy. Like, I like it. And then you're right. We get not one, but 2 huge twists, which we won't give away.
No,
There are
let's
2 big twists within 60 seconds, 90 seconds, like right at the end of the story. It's one of
mhm.
those rare times where you're watching a movie and you go, oh, that's what's happening. Interesting. And then not even a minute later, oh,
Oh,
no, it's something else. Like there's 2 big twists at the end. And then it just cuts back to the detective in Miranda story 2. And you're like, whoa, okay. Robert Bloch is firing on all cylinders here. He is not giving us anything really safe in this movie.
I really did. Yeah, I would say I think the first story is called Method for Murder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites out of the stories too. That and the third one, which
Okay.
third one I put my notes is Sweets to the Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the first one really did set the tone for this film to be like, we are a horror film and we do
Mm-hmm.
have these horror elements, but we're going to surprise you with things
Mm-hmm.
down the road too, with the comedy as well. And that first twist, I can remember thinking like, I'm seeing this coming along, but that second twist happening, I was like, oh, okay. And how they did it so quick. But I don't know if you were having this type of moment while watching each like story that I was like watching. I was thinking how this story really has maybe influenced or has made modern horror caught up on some of that trend too. Um,
Hmm.
like the method for murder, I kept thinking like, oh, this is kind of remind me of some movies that we have currently, like Gone Girl, where there's that
Yeah.
twist in there, and then we have like um, what other type of like movies I was thinking of? Side Effect with Channing Tatum in
Hmm.
there. Just like certain ones, I'm like thinking, wow, like they really kind of like paved that way for maybe writing movies in that way.
So you think David Fincher and Gillian Flynn, while developing Gone Girl, went back and watched The House That Dripped Blood?
Probably not specifically,
I
but if
would
they
love that.
did, I would be like, I love that, and I will support that.
Yeah. But I love horror stories about writers. Obviously, Stephen King has written a lot of them that were adapted to film. Misery
Mhm.
and The Shining, two prime examples of that. And I loved all the details in that first story. I love the details of him walking through the house and discovering like that wall of horror novels like on the shelf. There's Edgar Allan Poe. What was
Mhm.
another? There was another one called House of Death was a title
Yeah.
on the shelf, and he's kind of like flipping through the titles like, oh, this is really cool. And how he draws the villain of his new story, like he draws like a portrait of him and he thinks he saw him outside, and then the way that that portrait reflects on what the guy actually looks like. And I have a little bit of bias because I went to film school and my
Yeah.
senior thesis film was a horror movie about a girl who wrote horror stories, and the villain of her newest story starts coming to life in front of her eyes was the
Oh.
premise of my senior thesis film. And it's not a storyline I've really seen a whole lot in movies, and so to see it in this, I'm like, oh, back in 2007 no one accused me of stealing from the house to drip blood. But it was kind of
Exactly.
fun to see that story that I spent almost a year of my life with, to see that kind of manifested in this story. Very, very different from the one I did, but still with that central idea of like, what if the villain of the story you're writing on the page became a reality in front of you? And the
I do
way
wish
that
we.
the writer just keeps like, he's second guessing himself. It's like, am I
Mhm.
really crazy? Like, I'm clearly seeing this guy, but my wife doesn't see him, and what's going on here? And the way that gets paid off at the very end, I thought was handled well.
Yes.
Yeah. So I like that story a lot. Anything else we want to say about story one? I thought the actors were really strong in that. Uh,
I I really did like the special, like the makeup work of it too.
yeah, and the teeth.
Yeah, it kind of gave me some older like horror films that we've seen in like the 30s and 40s with how they created that whole look of the shots and lighting and
Mhm.
movie makeup in that way too. So it just made me kind of feel, I mean, I didn't live in that area, but some type of like nostalgic feeling like, oh, this is like classic horror moment. I'm
Mhm.
really digging this. I'm really into this. So yeah, I was like, I really love, I'm like so obsessed with the makeup work in the first one,
Mhm.
honestly, out of all of them, in my opinion.
Yeah, the makeup was fantastic. I love just the look of the whole movie. Like it looked, at least the version I watched on Amazon Prime, it looked really clean. Like the film itself looked great. That scene where he goes outside and he has the drawing of the villain and he throws it in the water in the river, and then you see it go down, and then the villain walks up and picks it up and smiles at him, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. Because there's a
Yeah.
lot of this movie indoors. So whenever we go outside, I thought that was nice too.
Hmm.
you know a detail you didn't get a lot of in this movie. It's a lot of like dark rooms and shadows, and so whenever we go outside and see green, I'm like, okay, sweet.
Yeah. It's like, ooh, brighten me up.
All right, so let's talk about story two with Peter Cushing, who goes to
Yes.
this museum of horror and finds this wax figure of a woman who reminds him of this woman of his own life that he's lost. So this was your least favorite of the four, is that what you said?
Um, I would say Yeah, I would say this is my least favorite just because I felt the maybe the anticipation, whatever, was just dragging for me a little bit, just a little bit.
Mm.
It was still good, but out of the four, I'm like, I wouldn't say it was my favorite
My
at all.
biggest problem with the second part, along with what I said, how it's really not about the house at all. So that was kind of weird.
Yeah, I think,
Is that it bothered me how they kept going into the Museum of Horror. I think he goes there 3 or 4 times, and
yeah.
they never pay anything. They just like walk inside and they just start roaming. That just felt
Hmm.
unbelievable to me that you'd have this place, a museum. There's nobody at the front. They just walk in and then they just go to the back. I'm like, okay. I know that's kind of
Exactly.
a weird detail to focus on, but it kept happening. I'm like, don't they have someone outside of this main guy who works there? Like, doesn't he have to pay rent on the place or no?
I guess not.
Like, just any random teenager can come in off the street and just start trashing the place, and nobody's around. Nobody would know.
Yeah, I think that was part of the details where I was just like disengaged because I was like, this doesn't feel connected with the whole flow
Mhm.
of the writing about the house and how the house brings all these stories together. I just felt maybe that was the thing, is it just felt very disconnected a
Yeah,
lot.
exactly. I think it needed he needed to take that wax figure to the house or something, and the wax figure comes to
Mhm.
life, and maybe is his the woman he like or something. Something needed to happen in those 25 minutes. Like something had to happen with the house itself in terms of like the outcome of the story, and it never does. And so in that way, it does feel a little disconnected from the other three stories. Like the major events of what happens, especially towards the end. And the other three stories all take place at the same house, but
Mhm.
not this one. It's all almost all at that museum. So that was kind of weird.
Yeah.
But Peter Cushing is an actor I always enjoy. I mean, when you think of like Hammer films, horror films, a lot of like the period horror from the 50s, 60s, 70s, there's two figures we think about, and that's Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And so,
Mhm.
like, he just has a just magnificent face. He's just like an interesting actor. So he made it
Mhm.
work for me. Like, I was able to not, be looking at my phone like while watching the second story because of Peter Cushing. I really like him as an actor.
Yeah, I would say more Christopher Lee was captivating for me,
Mm-hmm.
and all the stories that he was partaking in his characters and all. So I just love how authentic he can make a character seem just based on their like energy and their presence on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was just all about Christopher Lee in that
Cool.
way.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
let's talk about the third story. So we get a little girl, Christopher Lee's young daughter,
Yes.
and he hires a nanny slash teacher to kind of take care of her.
Yeah, and like, yeah, I was just a little confused about that. I was like, you hired a teacher, but you're allowing her, and she's also doing things kind of like a nanny. Exactly. I
Mhm.
was like, I was so confused, but maybe in that time, that was just how things were with as a homeschool teacher. Maybe I
Mhm.
don't know.
Yeah, so I like the third story. This, as I said before, this of the three, this is the one that dragged the most for me. I mean, there's like 15 minutes or more where there's nothing suspenseful at all happening. And at least in the second story, like the Museum of Horror with the wax figures, that's kind of mysterious, got some atmosphere. In the third story, there's a stretch where you're like, is this gonna have any horror at any time? So that was kind of my issue with it a little bit, but I still liked it. And Christopher Lee, always a great presence. And I thought the little girl did a great job too. Like sometimes little girl actresses can be, or little boys too, can be questionable. I thought she did a good job. She was believable.
Yeah, with this third story with Lee's portrayal of his character, the father,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was very good at being like ice cold, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion. Like, wow, I can feel the very authoritarian figure who's very just like to the rule book, but also very, very, very cold.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think what I appreciate about the third one is that it kind of did have like a little bit of a twist at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to kind of like just sit there and think like, wow, I was going one way with this story thinking, oh, it's the father who's this villain, but then really we get a twist at the end of no, the real villain here is this person and all. So I'm just like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. Was not kind of really expecting that, but also I have to be honest, any like witch or witchcraft, I am like a sucker for.
Okay.
So
Oh, there you go. Yeah, as
yeah,
you said the
I was like,
craft. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But the little girl actor, she kept going on thinking like other series and films. I don't know if you've seen the Haunting on Bly Manor on
On
Netflix.
Netflix. Yeah, yeah. She's in
Yeah,
that.
like
She's in
the
that?
no, it's
Oh.
just the actress in that just really made me
Oh,
think of
gotcha.
her too. Like they had like the same type of like acting style in that way.
Oh,
I was
okay.
like, ooh, I was like, she's giving me kind of like those vibes
hmm
of that too. So I really liked her
Yeah.
acting in it
So her
too.
I actually have her name. Her name, Chloe Franks, played the little girl Jane. Yeah, so
Okay.
I thought she was solid.
Yeah.
And I did like, we don't get any blood in this movie.
No, not at
We
all.
don't get the house dripping blood, but I won't give it away. But we do get something dripping at the end of
Mm-hmm.
story 3.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'll say. But yeah, I like the revelation about Christopher Lee's character. We kind of learn kind of why he's so icy cold towards the end of the story. I thought that worked really well. And yeah, and I haven't mentioned it yet. The score in this film I thought was outstanding. I loved the score of this, and it would change a little bit from story to story. And I thought that was a really strong element too. Even in those moments where I thought it dragged like maybe a little bit, the score was still keeping it alive for me. So let's talk about the fourth and final major story about the horror film star. I love that the movie begins with a story about a horror novelist and then
Yeah.
ends with a story about a horror film actor.
Mhm.
Robert Bloch, who's written a lot of scripts, and I'm sure he's been on productions and things like had some things to say about artists in the horror genre. So what did we like or dislike about the fourth and final major story about the film actor who goes and gets the cloak for his new production? Doesn't he say at one point he's been in 100 horror films? Like
Yeah.
he's been. I mean, this guy is what, in his 60s, early 70s. He's been acting in horror films for decades, and he
Mhm.
wants to get an authentic cloak that looks like a real vampire's cloak, but he gets it from the wrong guy.
Exactly.
So what do we
I
think of that one?
I mean, I think I liked it. I think this is the one that really stood out to me as more comedic,
Yes.
in my
The,
opinion. So
the
I think
funniest
that's
of the four.
yeah, I think that's where I was just like, I really appreciate them just making this the way it is. Like I feel like it was trying to be like a Wes Craven type of movie where it makes fun of itself
Mm-hmm.
type of thing. So I was very entertained and drawn in that way with it of like
Mm-hmm.
they're not trying to really take this serious, but they're not trying to be like childish, like too like washed down with their comedy. It's like
Yeah.
very entertaining. I
I
love
mean,
that
the
aspect
the
of it.
line about my favorite Dracula, of course, is Bela Lugosi, not that new fellow. I mean, there are some tongue in cheek little winks to the camera and to the knowing audience that I think you can't ignore. And yeah, just little details like when he first puts on the cloak and he looks in the mirror and he's not there, and then his
Yeah.
eyes go big, and then he takes off the cloak and he's back. I mean, there were some I'm like, okay, that's kind of silly. It's like there's nothing. It's hard to be like really scary in a segment about a film actor who acts in horror movies who starts becoming a vampire. I don't really know how you make that really, really scary. It would have had to have a different approach by the director.
Oh yeah. I was gonna say they would have to do a different type of approach with that. But yeah. I mean, also like I would still say this fourth movie is very atmospheric in a way
Mm-hmm.
too, of like the vampire genre or cult following, if you per se.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing too, like I kept appreciating, that's what you mentioned, is like the score and how the like shots are being like the lighting and effects of it too, which we'll get to later on about the effects. I'll talk about that later. But I think that was another thing that was a positive about this fourth one for me too. It's just like it's just cozy. It's so comforting to see like that type of
Mm-hmm.
classic horror magic on the screen.
And I thought the acting was solid. I really liked Ingrid Pitt. I wrote her name down, who played the actress in the movie, who gets kind of the big reveal at the end, like the twist. And I thought she was just strikingly gorgeous, and I thought she had a lot of
Exactly.
charisma. I don't think I've seen her in another movie, but I was like,
Yeah.
wow, she's got something. She's fantastic.
Yeah, I was like looking at her background and all, and I was like, wow, it's very, very small. Okay. Because I was like thinking the same thing. Like, I feel like I seen her in something
Mhm.
before, but I wasn't. And I was just like, okay, well, what happened with you with that? Like, because I felt like she just demanded the presence on the camera too. And it was very interesting to see that she didn't have that much of a big like history. It's kind of interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's another part of this podcast is looking at these older films, and like we just talked about George Lucas's first movie, THX 1138, and
Oh my gosh.
the female lead in that film is fantastic. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what else she did, and I look her up, and that's like her only movie. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
One and done.
Some of these actors, they do some films, and we don't know their story, right? We don't know what happened. I mean, maybe something came up, something family related, or had a change of heart about the business, or got pushed out of the bit. I mean, you don't know. I mean, so it's just kind of interesting to me, and always disappointing to me when somebody who has a lot of presence did not go on to have a great career. You're like, okay, I wonder what happened there. But yeah,
Yeah.
Ingrid Pitt is one I was like, oh, I want to keep an eye out for her if she's in other stuff coming up in the years to come, but she's not in a whole lot after this movie.
No.
Damn it. That's
Not
sad
too
as well.
much, I would say. You might be surprised with some, but not too much. And I'm kind of like, oh.
But yeah, I love the whole thing where like during a take of the movie they're making, he actually, with the cloak on, he actually bites her, and she
Hmm.
screams, and he comes over, he's like, I'm so sorry about that, and she's like, well, you can make it up to me by taking me to dinner.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
Very strong personality, and I love that.
And take me back to your place. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Because I have something to reveal to you. So yeah, I like the four. I mean, really, my favorite was the first one. Who I forgot to
Hmm.
mention, that guy who plays the main actor in that, Denholm Elliott as Charles. He was the main guy in the
Oh,
first segment.
that okay. I was gonna say, like, I didn't
He's
know.
an actor I feel like I've seen in other things. Like I'd seen him
Yeah.
in some other films of the era, but he was really great. So my favorite was the first one, but there was a lot of entertainment value to be had and great times to be had in the other three as well. And I've seen anthology horror films where one's great and the other two or three just don't work at all, and that's always just kind of frustrating. Or like, oh, or even when there's just one, there's like three stories, first and third are great, and the second one you're just like, all right, let's get on to
Let's
the
go.
next one. I didn't feel that in this one. I even
No.
feel it a little bit in Tales from the Crypt, which came out a year later. I might or might not talk about that next year on the podcast. The first story with Joan Collins about Set at Christmas is so amazing. It's so
Hmm.
great that nothing else really, can come back, can match the power of the first story. Where
Hmm.
even though I preferred the first story in this movie more so than the other three, I never felt like, oh, geez, none of this is really quite as good as that first 20 minutes. I never felt that. Like I really enjoyed it all the way to the end, including, which we won't give away, the ending. We've been having this. How do you feel about wraparound stories in anthology films? Usually they're kind of just there to like pad the time a little bit, and you're like, oh, I don't care about this guy. I want to go into the stories. I actually found the detective character kind of interesting, and then what happens to him in the last 5 to 10 minutes after the stories have ended, I actually thought worked pretty well and tied
Yeah.
in with a previous story. And so I'm not so sure about the very last shots where a certain actor turns to the camera and does a monologue before walking
Mm.
off. That was a bit, it was almost
Dramatic.
too like comedic, tongue in cheek. Like, it'd be like if at the end of Robert Wise's 1963 horror film, The Haunting,
Oh yeah.
Robert Wise, like instead of having that really creepy voiceover at the end of that movie, Robert Wise himself walked up to the camera and did this. And all right, the house that has stood still for 100 years. Like I felt like that should have been narration, not one of the actors to like face us and tell us about the house. Was a kind of a strange final shot to end on. I'm like, okay.
I don't know
not
if
not
they
wouldn't
just
be my
like
choice.
yeah, I just don't know if they were like doing that just to help the audience like piece together the whole story or whatever. I was like, I mean, I don't know if that's an insult for people on that too, or if they were trying to do like a comedy type of element in there, and
Yeah.
it did drop the ball for me there too, because I was kind of like, this seems like very different from the most of the movie in this part,
Hmm.
really.
Yeah, it was just a little too knowing. And yeah, there's no other moment of the whole film where a character actually looks at us and talks to us. So if
Yeah.
maybe if the movie had opened with that same guy doing that for a minute and then the movie began and then he
Hmm.
ended doing it a second time, maybe that could have worked. But because it's
Maybe.
just
Yeah.
so out of left field, you're like, and the previous scene has such great power. It's a great kind of final big horror scene with the detective character. I felt
Yeah.
like we could have just ended with maybe a brief little bit of narration looking at the house and then roll credits. I didn't think we needed. I mean, that guy talks for at least a minute, right? A minute, minute and a half. He's just talking. I'm like,
Yeah, it
okay.
was a good yeah, it was a good amount of time, and I was kinda like, "Where are we going with this?"
That was like every horror movie should end this way, right? The last shot
Yeah,
of
true.
Halloween should have been, Sam Loomis turning to the camera. Now, what is happening here is that Michael Myers has escaped yet again
Yeah,
because he's not a human being. He's a force of evil and he cannot be stopped. Have a nice drive home.
I'd be like,
Walks
"Thank you for."
away and hugs Jamie Lee. I mean, wouldn't have been quite the same
Yeah.
ending of Halloween. But I mean, this movie kind of gets away with it. It's kind of like this fun anthology film. It's fine. It's okay. Doesn't ruin it. All right. So anything else about the movie? We've touched on all the stories. Any other performances you want to talk about? Anything that the director Peter Duffel brought to this movie? You said you wanted to talk a little bit about like makeup effects and atmosphere. Anything else you wanted to touch on about that, just in the movie as a whole?
I just I would just also say too, it was very, again, I keep repeating this, it was just very interesting to see how this style of anthology has really, um I like try to place myself in the shoes of like, let's just say a young teenager watching this for the first time and back in 1971.
Yeah.
And I'm like thinking like this is like so cool just to see how these four elements in this movie just really like again just get you into the mood of the spooky season and all
Mm-hmm.
that. So especially now I can still kind of feel like younger in a way. It's just weird to describe it. It's like I feel like excited younger when I'm watching this movie and like getting into like the excitement of watching this, even though it does have like the comedy elements that we mentioned or the horror. Um, it just is very nice to just like kind of like be in that escapism of like
Mm-hmm.
get out of my adult world and go into my excited childhood, I guess, life. Maybe that's probably why I was thinking too, like, there isn't really any blood, like you said, but maybe if we added blood and added more of
Yeah.
like some
Mm-hmm.
different type of content in there. So maybe they were trying to keep it PG, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is a great kind of way into the horror realm of cinema, with younger kids, right? Like I feel like even in 71, like I feel like a 7, 8, 9 year old probably could have watched this movie, might have been
Yeah.
confused by some of it. But, there's no gore. I mean, this is 71. By now, the MPAA has been introduced. You can do anything you want, really, in like,
Mhm.
an R-rated film or an NC-17, which would have then been X. And there's a lot of films pushing the boundaries already in the early 70s, but this is
Yeah.
a case of a movie, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like this movie feels like a movie that would have come out in like 62 or even
Yeah.
late 50s. Like if you had told me this movie was made in 1959, I probably would have been okay.
Yeah.
I
I
wouldn't have
believe that.
doubted it. This is not a movie pushing the genre forward by any means. It's not a
Mhm.
movie that's looking forward in the decade of the 70s where we're going to get a lot of like grittier, dirtier movies, both in the horror genre and outside of it. This is kind of a callback movie to like the, kind of a fun horror romp from the 50s or something, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not
I think
Last
that,
House on the Left.
yeah. No, no, no.
But I liked Peter Duffel's directing job. I thought the whole movie had a really great pace to it. It
Yeah.
took its time, but it was never really boring. Like there was a nice deliberate pacing to each story. I felt like the length of each story was about the right amount, right?
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't too short, didn't go, you know, it could have been a case where one of the 4 stories went to 45 minutes or something and it would have been over long. I thought like the pacing and this, you know, it's like each short, it's like 4 short films here, and each one has kind of like a nice act 1, act 2, act 3 twist ending. Like I thought that worked pretty well. And there's like moments of really nice atmosphere and some jolts throughout the movie that keep it a horror film. It's not just like a suspense mystery film. Like he does some nice things in the wax museum, and you know, in the first story, as I mentioned, with the villain, and like the shots of him hiding behind couches and stuff, I thought worked really well. And so I, you know, I mean, this is not a director we talk about.
No.
The great horror directors of the last 100 years. I don't think Peter Duffel's name will come up, but I thought he did a nice job in this movie, and I wanted to mention him too.
I agree. Yeah. I would say, um, I think watching this now as a person who was never came across this movie beforehand, it really did like have me intrigued of like what his other background work
Mm-hmm.
is and what that looked like, and maybe if it evolved as well too.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say this is like, if this is his first film, like making and all, like I would say this is a really good first film
Mm-hmm.
creation and it's under his belt. So I really did appreciate it overall of its being like charming in its
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah, as I said before, he mostly worked in television as a director. He has like
Yeah.
4 to 6 feature film credits as director. I don't know if he made another horror film. I'd have to look deeper, but I had not heard of any of the other credits. So yeah, it might be a director I come across again as we continue on the podcast. All right, so
Hmm.
my final question about this movie, Marcus, you
Yeah.
know, looking at this film through a 2021 lens, thinking about the world of horror cinema over the last 50 years, if someone were to take this same story, this script that Robert Bloch wrote and wanted to update it and do it in the 2020s, like what do you
Okay.
think would be different about this movie? If someone, a huge fan, a horror director, a huge fan of the House of Drip Blood, said, I'm gonna, not a lot of people know about this movie. I want to make it in the 2020s, whether it be in the United States or overseas. You know,
Okay.
like what stylistically would be similar or different in a new version of the story, do you think?
Oh, I think it'd be a complete 180 for sure. I think like the first thing that comes up into mind is we kind of seen that in Evil Dead, from the original to the remake,
Okay.
how completely different those were. Like the original, yes, horror, but I think it had some comedic moments in there. But then like the remake, straight up body gore,
Mm-hmm.
only horror. There's no like really comedy. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
there's some like wittiness in there, but not really comedy like the first one. So in this sense, with this movie, if it was going to be remade, I feel like it would be the same way because especially the type of directors that we currently have now that are very popular,
Mm.
and if they want to sink their teeth into it, I mean, I can see them not really trying to keep up with the original with its like style.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would definitely do a lot more, definitely blood.
Yeah, there'd be more
And
blood.
yeah,
There would have to be a scene of the house dripping blood, right?
yeah, I think they would like probably catch on to that. But I would hope that they would actually stick with the practical
Mm.
effects like they did with
Yeah.
House of Drip Blood. Maybe, I mean, of course, improvements, but just the utilization of practical effects as well. I would hope they just keep that charm to it because I think that's what makes
Mm-hmm.
the House that Drip Blood charming in its way as well too.
Yeah, I think the one big difference, I mean, again, it would depend on the director. I think it would be scarier. The emphasis would be, let's make this not so jokey, especially that 4th story. Let's make this scary and like really freak out the audience and do something modern with these stories that, you know, for the most part, you know, these stories could be made in any decade. I mean, there's, you know, the idea of a horror novelist who starts seeing his villain in front of him, and a guy who makes a lot of vampire movies gets a cloak, he starts turning into a vampire. I feel like these stories transcend whatever year or decade you're doing that. I feel like you could do all 4 of these stories today. I mean, I guess the
Yeah.
hardest one might be the wax figure, one. I mean, I don't know how many museums of horror there are in 2021, but that one might be tricky. I mean, there is that. Isn't there one in LA? Like it's got like whack, but it's like celebrities.
I know there's one in New Orleans too. I've been to
Okay.
that one. Yeah, I think it just depends on the location for sure and all, but I don't think, yeah, it's very
But I would buy
popular.
if they made in 2021, if they made this in Britain and there were
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, there's this museum of horror down the street, like in, downtown, whatever city it's in. Like I could buy that. I could believe
Yeah,
that was
I'd
there.
totally go and try it out. Let's do it.
Then I think the way to get the dripping blood on the house would be to have that character take the head of the woman back to
Mhm.
the house, and she comes to life, and that creates like the house bleeding from top to bottom. I think we got it. I think we have the story.
Just create like an Amityville horror type of thing.
Yeah. And I think the stories would probably move a little bit faster. I say that on most of these episodes. Like it's just so amazing to me just to think about how, one way that cinema has changed over 50 years, for the most part, not in every film, and especially in like some independent films, including horror, is that just the way movies move now, they just move so much faster, right? There's this terrifying idea that if the movie takes its time in this era we're in now, the audience is going to check out. Whereas
Yeah.
almost every film I've looked at for the podcast so far, they move slowly. You have to
Hmm.
like go with it.
I
There's not a
think
whole lot of like fast cutting or anything in these older films.
I think if they were going to do like slow movement in today's modern, they'd have to make it like dreadful for the audience. Like not dreadful, like, oh my God, this is so long, just dreadful, like anticipation.
Yeah.
Oh, I can see them maybe doing that, but they would have to definitely make it like a dread, like, oh my gosh, let's just get to that point. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh, what is going to happen? And all. So I can see them doing that as well, too, if
Because
they want to keep that.
the best horror films I've seen in the last 5-6 years move slowly, right? Movies like
Yeah.
It Follows and
Hmm.
Hereditary. Like but it's not like you're bored. You're on the edge of your seat. You don't want the movie to rush, right? We're
No.
developing characters and seeing kind of these unusual relationships between characters and the twists and turns, and a lot of these really great kind of slower horror films of the last few years I've really come to admire.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the same thing too with all those like points that you made about like Hereditary and It Follows and maybe even Midsummer too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they all had, I think that's where we're also seeing maybe like a pivotal in our 2020s is they're kind of like showing like importance of character development.
Mm-hmm.
So with this one, The House That Drip Blood, maybe they would also probably add that in there too. Like they would focus on character development heavily more too,
Mm-hmm.
just to maybe try to build more emotional ties in a way, and maybe just maybe, or because that's something in anthology horror I haven't seen in too much is like character development,
Because there's not enough
effectiveness.
time.
Yeah, there is that. I'm like, damn.
So I would give this movie a enthusiastic 3.5 stars out of 4. The House of Drip Blood. I'll be curious to see if I watch another horror film this year released in 1971 that I
Mhm.
like more than this one. I looked at the list. I mean, there's a couple films we're going to talk about later this year that are close to being horror films, like Clint Eastwood's film debut, Play Misty for Me, which is about
Oh
where
yeah.
he plays a disc jockey, and she just passed away, the late great Jessica Walter from Arrested Development. She
Hmm.
is kind of the female obsessive stalker fan of his in that movie. I've only seen it once, like in high school, but I remember it being kind of a horror film, especially towards the end. So I don't know if I'll necessarily call that a horror film or just like a thriller when we
Hmm.
get there. But I don't think 71, there's not really that much in the horror realm. So this might be, come December, my favorite of the genre I watched for this year. So I'm glad I took a chance on it. It was kind of a late breaker. I was like, any horror films that came out in April, May, and I did a deep dive and I'm like, oh, this one could be good. I'm glad I
Yeah,
took a look and that we got a chance to talk about it.
I would definitely. I mean, my ranking of it. I at first, I'll admit, at my first, I was like, I'm gonna probably just give this like a 2 out of 10.
2 out of
But
10?
yeah, I was like, that was my first reaction though.
Okay.
I was like, I give it, but then I kind of just sat there thinking and let it like marinate and sit
Yeah.
with me more. Instead of being impulsively like 2 out of 10. I would definitely give it like a 4 out of 10 for me, just
Okay.
because I feel like this is like one of those horror films that I could go back and revisit during like maybe the month of October
Okay.
and just like, pop it in, watch with some friends, or pop it in just to like, again, theme of like Halloween and all that. So I was like, this is not like a bad early 1970s
Mhm.
movie, in my opinion. I've seen a lot worse than this. So I was like, I'm actually really appreciative of this, but I don't think a lot, I don't know.
Well,
Because I have a lot.
you are a hard grader. In this entire conversation, I did not get the sense that you were at 2 out of 10. Like you sounded more like a 7.
Yeah, I know. I was like, that's where I developed more into maybe like a 4 out of 10
Okay.
because but impulsively like, right at the end, I was just like annoyed with the monologue at the end. I was like, you know what? That made
That
me
did it.
feel not a particular way. But then I was like, hold up, take a step back.
The last you were at like a 6 or 7, and then that last minute you went 2.
Too.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I mean, if looking at 100 years of horror films, if I had to like put everything like, this gets 10 out of 10, this gets 0 out of 10, like on that scale, this movie would be lower. It'd probably be
Yeah,
in 3 or 4, not in the top, 7, 8, 9, 10. But just, I mean, maybe it's because I really haven't talked about horror very much on the podcast since I launched this in September, and I really had a great time. But when it comes to horror films, especially ones that aren't really famous, ones that I just kind of discover,
hmm
I judge it by, okay, did I enjoy myself? I enjoyed
exactly.
myself the entire time. There's nothing groundbreaking in this, right? So it's not going to get a 4 out of 4. But I don't know. I've had some rough goes on the podcast so far. Like I've had
Yeah.
some movies where I'm an hour in, it's deadly dull, and I'm saying to myself, why am I doing this podcast? But this movie for me was a reason why, because I got to discover this kind of hidden horror gem I never would have seen, and I really enjoyed
Exactly.
it. I'm excited to watch it again at some point. I really liked it. So there you
Exactly.
go. All right, so that takes us to our final 2 segments. The first one is called the Divine Double Feature. That's where
hmm
we talk about a more modern film that is either similar in its anthology aspects or just in tone or horror or whatever you want to talk about. What do you think would make a really cool newer movie that you would advise someone to put on right after The House That Dripped Blood ended to make a double feature? What would be kind of a cool newer film to do that with?
Yeah. So I would definitely select the Mortuary Collection. Right now it's being played on Shudder,
Okay, what's
and
it
it
called?
came out the Mortuary Collection.
Oh, The Mortuary. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a 2019 film, and fun fact, I didn't know this until doing my research. The same production company is the same production company that made The House That Dripped Blood. So I was like,
Really?
wow. Yeah, I was like, wow, what
The
a
same
nice,
production company has been
yeah,
around since 71 and did the 2019
yeah.
Mortuary Collection. Okay.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I was like, I kind of just like taken back, like, this is just fate. It was meant to be type of thing. But I would say it would be a definite great follow up with this film, just because if you're especially one that's like, okay, I need something extra spooky, creepy, whatever, and still following that whole um, storyline
Mhm.
or similarities, this would be a great one, in my opinion.
Okay, cool. I have not seen that or heard of that. It's on Shutter, which I subscribe to, so I will be checking that out shortly. That sounds
Yeah,
fantastic. I
yeah,
also went with, so that's an anthology film, right?
yes.
Okay. So I also went with an anthology film. My favorite anthology horror film, at least the last 15 years, and that's Trick or Treat from 2009,
Oh my gosh,
which
yeah.
is just fantastic. I've seen it at least 3 times. It's such a great one to put on Halloween week. Like it's a because it's a lot about Halloween, and It's a lot of fun. And I think like if there's one film of the last 15 years that's done the anthology horror film just really well, it's that one, which also, like The House of Drip Blood, just has one director. If you look, a lot of these anthology horror films, especially newer ones of the last 5 years, it's like a different director for every story.
Yeah.
But Trick or Treat is all Michael Dougherty. And I just thought such a creative, often terrifying, sometimes funny, just a really great time. And I think it's a good way to show the evolution of the anthology horror film from 1971 to 2009. You can kind of see that evolution as well. And if you thought that The House of Drip Blood was a little too slow at parts, you get a lot more for your your money in Trick or Treat, which definitely moves faster, has more blood, has more, maybe not more surprises, because there's a lot of surprises in The House of Drip Blood, but just a lot of fun, more supernatural stories, and would make a really cool double feature. I think I might do it at some point.
Yeah, do it.
Exactly. All right, so our final segment is called Beyond the Flick. For this one, I wanted to talk about anthology horror films. So if you had to pick 2 or 3 of your all-time favorite feature films that are anthologies for horror, what would you pick?
So I wrote down here some of my favorite ones is Creepshow from 1982. I
might talk about that one.
Yeah, I am so obsessed with that one. I think it's just because of Stephen King's involvement with it, because I'm just such a Stephen King nerd about his work.
You get Stephen King, George Romero, and Tom Savini on the same production.
Like triple threat, you can't go wrong. And my other one would be from Tales from the Crypt.
From 1972?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
or the show.
I would say both 1972 and the show, because I could not pick between the two when I was thinking. I was like, I really did enjoy both of them at an equal level. But I don't know. I just thought it was, I don't know. But another one too, I think I saw that Tales from the Crypt is produced by the same company as well.
That did House of Drip Blood?
Yeah, I think it was too. I think it was.
They have a similar feel to them, like the production design and the look. Like there's definitely something similar between those two movies.
Yeah, and so I just liked. Really, I think the thing that both the show and the movie from 1970s is just like that contain that campy horror feels. So I'm just a sucker for campy horror as well. So those would be my top 2 favorite anthologies.
Yeah, Tales from the Crypt from 72 would be one of my runners up, along with The Vault of Horror, which is another anthology film made around the same time. Scream Factory put out a disc a few years ago, I want to say, that I got that had both of those movies on them, Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror. So if you haven't seen Vault of Horror, that's also a really cool film made, I believe, around the same time. That also has some anthology aspects to it, some really creepy short films in that. Speaking of Stephen King, 1985's Cat's Eye, where the wraparound story is Drew Barrymore.
Yeah, she was very popular in the horror in that age for her, or just like supernatural or alien, I don't know, any type. That was like a big time frame for her.
Yeah, the year before that, she was in Firestarter, also adapted from Stephen King. And Stephen King was just on Drew Barrymore's new talk show. I don't know if you saw this. And they talked about Firestarter and Cat's Eye for a few minutes. It was actually really cool. I was like, that's a conversation I never thought I'd see. I mean, Drew Barrymore, obviously very famous, horror background for being in Scream, one of the most famous opening sequences of a horror film ever. And I believe she also brought back the character of Casey in a little short film for her talk show too. Sometimes that's fun when an actor crosses over and does a talk show, and then they get these opportunities to bring guests on the show that they worked with in a film that you might have liked from 30 years ago, and they talk about it. I've always really enjoyed that. You don't see that too often, but
same. Yeah.
So that's been fun. Let's see. Creepshow 2, which is not of the same quality as 1. I don't believe Stephen King played much of a role in the making of the second one, although they are based on some of his or all of his stories. I love The Raft, which is from one of
Ooh,
his
yeah.
early collections. The short
Hmm.
film The Raft in Creepshow 2, I think, is fantastic. So check that out.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you've seen this. This was also put out through Scream Factory. Body Bags, which is
No.
directed by. I don't think all of them are directed by John Carpenter. He might have just done the first or the first two, but it's called Body Bags, and John Carpenter himself is in the movie as like the wraparound character, and he's got
Shut
like
up.
ghoulish makeup on and long like gray hair, and he's like doing the Boris Karloff, like setting up each story. And it was meant to be, I believe, like a series or something. This was like a pilot, and then
Okay.
it never went, and so all we got was this like 90-minute pilot, this movie, and it's a lot of fun. Like the first segment, directed by Carpenter, is really creepy. As a huge Carpenter fan, I've been trying to seek out everything he did. I just watched this amazing TV movie he put out in 1978 called Someone's Watching Me, a movie
Yes.
he wrapped filming 2 weeks before he went into production on Halloween. So they were like close together. So I'm watching this movie, Someone's Watching Me, like trying to find like any pieces of Halloween and this, and
Hmm.
there is a little bit, you can kind of see some similar
Trends.
sensibilities there, some trends.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I would say check out Body Bags if you've never heard of it or seen it. It's a lot of fun. Mark
I've heard of
Hamill.
it.
Mark Hamill is in the last story, and he is fantastic. I'm almost
Oh,
100% Carpenter didn't direct the last segment. I can't remember who did, but Mark Hamill's in it too. He's great. Early 90s. I believe it came out in 93. And then I only saw, I don't know if I even watched the whole thing, but I need to see its sequel to VHS is a really famous
yeah.
anthology horror film of the last 10 years. What was that, like 2011?
Yep.
I want to say that came
Hmm.
out. Yeah. So I have to revisit that again. I saw it a long time ago. But I was looking on Wikipedia at like the last 10 years of anthology horror films, and there were so many titles I'd never heard of. So I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I got to dig into these and see which one of these are worth my time.
I'm
All
gonna
right, so
say
these,
I think it's
yeah,
really good, man. Oh, I was just gonna say I think it's really catching fire or catching popularity with anthology horror, and it's
mhm.
making me even like kind of curious to see how it's going to look in the 2020s if they're going to do
Yeah.
anything different.
I think the way we consume media now, it makes more sense to have an anthology horror story be a series, right? To do
Mhm.
just like, series of 8 or 10 episodes, like Shudder did with the new Creep Show reiteration,
Exactly.
right? Where it's just you tune in every week or whatever for a new episode, kind of like Tales from the Crypt did in the 90s, right?
Mhm.
I mean, these days when we're consuming all sorts of storytelling on Netflix and Shudder and Hulu and everything, it's kind of like to make a feature length movie 2 hours long of 3 or 4 stories put together. I almost feel like now you're not going to really see that very much anymore, because we just
Mhm.
we don't want to sit there for 4 stories. We want to watch one story and then come back, watch another one. So
Mhm.
it kind of makes more sense now. Like, as we talked about before with the House that Drip Blood, I almost feel like if this were done today, it'd probably be an anthology series that we would watch one story at a time, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So we probably should have mentioned that earlier. But
Oh,
finally, yeah, finally, Marcus, these are my three favorites. So number three, I would put Trilogy of Terror from 1975. And I say that not really remembering what the other two stories were, but the
okay.
story with Karen Black and this little figure that is chasing her around this like apartment is something I saw when I was very young, and I have never been able to get it out of my mind. It is terrifying. Probably if I were to look
Okay.
at it again now, it'd probably be kind of cheesy. But Karen Black, a really underrated actress, I think, who is just phenomenal in Five Easy Pieces, which was kind of like the kickoff episode to this podcast. I think she's
Hmm.
really great in that. And it's a really fun story. So I'm going to take a look at that one again.
Okay.
And then number two, you might not have heard of this one. This is the earliest anthology horror film I've seen, and that's called Dead of Night from 1945.
Nope.
It's a British film, black and white, super creepy. There's this haunted mirror story. I believe it's the last story of the film that just really gives you goosebumps. It's got this like weird mid 40s black and white aesthetic that you will not find in any other real anthology horror film made before or since. That I just think it's there's something really really frightening about it that I enjoy. So I've seen that twice. I've had a few people ask me over the years, like, what's a horror film I've never heard of that
Well, there
you
you
would
go.
recommend? And I often say, The Innocents from 1961, which is based on Turn of the Screw. That is really terrifying, which I love, with Deborah Kerr. And the other film I always tell people is Dead of Night from 1945. Find it. I don't even know if it's streaming anywhere or where you can find it online or whatever, but check it out. It's really
I'm
great.
gonna have to, yeah, because I haven't heard that one, and I'm like, I would say starting from 2019 or 2018 is when I started exploring more anthology horrors.
Okay.
Because Trick or Treat, I will admit, was really just kind of fueled my fire for interest. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, granted, I watched the others early or before Trick or Treat, but really I just didn't like get enticed, I guess, to really look out for anthology horror. So it's definitely neat to hear some other ones that watch and kind of see like again influence. I'm nerding out like that. I was like, I just want to see like how other older horror films have influenced
Yeah.
current modern ones. So I had to put that on my list. I haven't
Yeah,
heard that.
definitely put it on your list. And another
Yeah.
decade of horror that's not great, and that's the 1940s, right? You go to the 1930s, you get all the great monster movies like Frankenstein and Dracula and Bride of Frankenstein and some of these other ones. 1940 to 1949, it's pretty abysmal. Like there's like
Yep.
nothing. And I
Hmm.
tell people like the best horror film of the 40s that I've seen is Dead of Night. So check it out.
Okay.
And then my favorite has to be, as you said, Creepshow from 1982. It's just got all the ingredients I love. It's got King, it's got Romero, it's got Savini. Not every story I love. The final story with the bugs, I know a lot of
Oh yeah.
people adore it. It's not my favorite, but I really love the other ones a lot, especially the story with Leslie Nielsen and Ted Danson. And my favorite of the stories is The Crate, which I just think is just fantastic.
Hmm.
I
It
love
is.
Hal Hall. We just lost Hal Holbrook, and he's great in it. And Adrienne Barbeau, who's just just the most like just nails on a chalkboard wife character you've ever seen in a movie, and the way that she is dealt with at the end is just so
Hmm.
like horrifying and creative. And I love the look of the monster and the wraparound story, which the boy in that movie, did you know, is played by Joe Hill, Stephen
Yes.
King's son, who
Son.
would go
Yeah.
on to become, a really great horror novelist himself. I've read a couple of his books. He's fantastic. And
Right.
the atmosphere, the animation, it's early 80s special effects. So everything you're seeing is there on the screen. I think
Hmm.
nothing can ever take the power of that away. Even now, when we have the best visual effects in the universe, it's not the same as seeing it on the screen.
It's
So
not. It's
it's
not.
just such a blast. If you've never seen Creepshow, or if it's been a long time, check out Creepshow. It's always a lot of fun.
Yes, please do.
All right, so that takes us to the end of our conversation here, Marcus. Thanks so much for joining me. This has been a blast. I wanted
Yeah.
to end here, if you can just tell our listeners, where they can find you online. You mentioned you have a YouTube channel. So yeah, promote
Yes.
it, talk about it. Now's the time.
Well, I am currently on YouTube as Salem Queer, just all one word. And what I do on there is I do quick movie reviews of all different types of horror and psychological thriller films. I also do like rankings list on there too, so different type of topic rankings list of movies. And I also talk about some different horror books and merchandise and all that good stuff. Also, I'm on Instagram doing my series of quick movie reviews. So they're a little bit smaller and quicker than the YouTube ones, I would say. And again, my Instagram page on there is Sam Queer, all one word.
Okay, yeah, we'll check that out. So thanks
Thank
again
you.
for being here, Marcus, and thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/filmat50. We have at least 2 exclusive bonus episodes every month for paying members. So check that out and support the podcast. Until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.